Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Winter Show. We're delighted to have you here at this year's edition of America's leading art, antiques, and design fair. My name is Helen Allen, and I am director of the show. As many of you know, the Winter Show is a celebration of exceptional art and craftsmanship. It is also a benefit for Eastside House Settlement. Founded in 1891, Eastside House is a service organization based in the South Bronx that provides life-changing programs to New Yorkers in need. Every ticket that's purchased to enter the show for any event or for general admission actually goes to really transform lives. So I want to applaud you all for your part in helping really transform New Yorkers' lives. Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's panel discussion, Ann and Gordon Getty, Patronage, Philanthropy, and Legacy. This conversation will delve into the remarkable impact of Ann and Gordon Getty's support of the arts and their enduring legacy in cultural philanthropy. We are fortunate to have with us three distinguished panelists to guide us in this discussion. Christine Donahue Kavanagh, our moderator, is the Vice President of Collection Sale Management at Sotheby's, New York. She brings luxury specialist expertise and many years of experience in the auction house business, assisting private collectors and institutions throughout the Americas. Maria Santangelo, the co-founder and managing director of Bullimore Partners. Maria has over 2 decades of curatorial experience in the European decorative arts and sculpture, most recently at the Detroit Institute of Arts and in the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. Santangelo was recruited by Ann and Gordon Getty in 2017 and served as their chief curator before launching Bullimore Partners with our next panelist in 2024. Santangelo has published widely and contributed to numerous museum exhibitions and publications. Caitlin Yates, also co-founder of Bullimore Partners, is a cross-category fine and decorative art specialist with a deep understanding of the art market. She has worked for private galleries in the US and in the UK, and has worked at Christie's in London for a decade. Yates returned to the US when she was recruited to serve as the art collection manager for the Ann and Gordon Getty collection before launching Bullimore Partners with Maria in 2024. Santangelo and Yates were indispensable figures in the successful management and the dispersal of the Ann and Gordon Getty art collection, working alongside the Gettys and their legal, administrative, and financial teams. Their firm, Bullimore Partners, is an art advisory and collection management firm specializing in strategic, estate, and legacy planning for fine and decorative arts and luxury goods. Santangelo and Yates are facilitators to collectors and estate trustees in their role as custodian, providing independent, trustworthy, and unbiased advice, as well as the highest level of ongoing collection care and management. In this capacity, they have continued on as Gordon Getty's art advisors alongside other private clients. Please join me in giving them a warm welcome as we explore this fascinating topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you for all of you for joining us this afternoon. I see so many familiar faces, which is great. For those of you we haven't met, we will be around after the discussion, so please come say hi and introduce yourselves. After that beautiful introduction, Helen, we might just dive in to the first question. I will say our intent for this afternoon is to really have this be more of an informal conversation about using Ann and Gordon Getty's collection almost as a case study so that we can look to the past and see how it can affect our approach to collecting today and in the future. So my first question should be quite easy. Tell us a little bit about Ann and Gordon Getty, how they fit within the Getty family, and what were the choices that they made when they were building their collection.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you everyone for joining us here today. Important is we're talking about Ann and Gordon Getty, who we will refer to as Mr. and Mrs. Getty throughout the talk today. Mr. Getty, or Gordon Getty, is the last surviving son of J. Paul Getty. So it's important that's really the part of the family we're discussing here today. And going back about 50 years, really the start of Mrs. Getty's collecting history, it's helpful to look at some of the themes and early inspirations and when she was forming her collection. The earliest, which we of course have to refer to here on the screen, is J. Paul Getty in front of his home, Sutton Place, in 72. Mrs. Getty was certainly inspired by J. Paul. He was well known as being a fervent decorative arts collector, and his collection and his bequest went on to become the Getty Museum and the Getty Villa in Los Angeles. Certainly, J. Paul's passion for French history and decorative arts inspired Mrs. Getty, and she once said, "This exposure brought to me an appreciation, but fine French furniture is very expensive and virtually impossible to find. I took his enthusiasm, but supplemented them with comparable English furniture." His influence certainly stuck with her, but as she started to really create her collection in her own right. When we talk about the Ann and Gordon Getty collection, it's essential to remember this is not a multi-generational collection. This is a collection that Mrs. Getty really created as she was self-educating herself. Really, her earliest forays into collecting came when they were making family trips to visit J. Paul at Sutton Place. So the Getty family would go at least annually to go visit with him, and certainly she was also exposed to English country homes, which was something that certainly stuck with her throughout her collecting history. On the screen here, you can see a painting by Winston Churchill of the Long Gallery at Sutton Place, where J. Paul lived out the rest of his life. This painting was once in the collection of J. Paul. Mr. and Mrs. Getty acquired it in '83, so an early purchase, and it found a really wonderful permanent place in their blue parlor at Broadway. Although there were several pieces, Mrs. Getty, as I mentioned, they didn't inherit anything from J. Paul. There were some pieces Mrs. Getty bought later that had J. Paul Getty provenance. But on these trips to London, Mrs. Getty started visiting London dealers, and as her confidence grew, she started to buy at auction as well. The first auction we know she attended was the Mentmore Tower sales that were held by Sotheby's in '77, a remarkable series of sales to start collecting at. We don't know of anything in the collection she bought at that sale, but she did buy things later with Mentmore Tower provenance. And another important note is even in her nascent collecting, Mrs. Getty, you started to see this affinity and interest in provenance and particularly esteemed English collections. But nearly everything in the collection was really personally selected by Mrs. Getty and kind of creating this grand narrative that she was weaving for the Getty family in San Francisco. So the Getty family moved into their primary residence in San Francisco, which we'll refer to as the Broadway residence today, really in the by 1972. It was a Willis Polk home that was built around 1915 for Albert Ehrman. Mr. and Mrs. Getty embarked, or they engaged with Sister Parrish and Albert Hadley to help furnish their home. And Mrs. Getty was deeply inspired by working with Sister Parrish in particular. I love this quote. She certainly appreciated her never overthought, sophisticated, and comfortable rooms. Working with her gave me a finer understanding of elegance and comfort. Formal rooms don't have to be stiff and starchy. And this is a constant you see in all of Mrs. Getty's interiors. Everything was lived with and used, from the Linnell armchairs that were designed for Badminton House. But even she had a wonderful service of Meissen Gelberloh that was once owned by the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, which the household or kitchen staff always referred to as the short rib dishes. So things were used, they were taken incredibly good care of, but everything was personal and meaningful, really, in their collection. And even when you walk through the home today, Mr. and Mrs. Getty's collective love of music and science is certainly on display, or even little elements of grandchild's love of elephants you'll see certainly throughout many of the interiors. Although the collection was, as I mentioned, it had the appearance of being multi-generational, but it wasn't. She really formed this collection over maybe 4 decades, but it grew exponentially to over 9,000 pieces. And I think counting the sites, we felt there was maybe about a dozen sites that had property contained in it. It was a living, breathing collection. Things were always on the move. Mrs. Getty generously lent things to friends and family, and their homes were also furnished as well with a lot of her pieces. And a lot of these homes were filled with children, pets, and lots of parties as well. So Mrs. Getty had an inquisitive mind, and she was really an ardent student of the arts and sciences. She was a voracious reader. She really wanted to understand how things were made and the culture from which they came. She did her research. She consulted with experts and specialists across numerous fields. She really strove to really seek out the finest in her collecting. And as she got a little more comfortable, and as I mentioned, her confidence grew, the collection just exponentially took off. She often cited the influence of her deep love of archaeology and paleontology in her collecting journey. She participated in and funded innumerable digs, which brought her immeasurable joy and really a keen eye for detail as well. Mrs. Getty was really endlessly curious and also broad in her collection. She drew, as many people do, collectors, a lot of inspiration from her travels. She would meet with artisans and really wanted to get a deeper understanding of how things were made and how they were constructed, whether that was furniture carving or gilding or weaving. She even traveled to Jing on several occasions to learn a little more about porcelain production. She really understood and cared for the value of craftsmanship. She had a deep love of textiles and ceramics and traditional craft, which brought her to many far-flung places such as Burma and India and Egypt, long before they were fashionable destinations for collectors and designers. As many of you know, Mrs. Getty went on to establish Ann Getty Associates, a design business around 1995.
And the only thing I'll add is, as we're looking at these images here, you see bolts and bolts and bolts of these textiles. One of the things that is absolutely incredible is the depth to which Mrs. Getty collected, and every category was museum quality. So we're looking at these beautiful silk textiles, but these are hand-woven silks that were made for Versailles or that you would see in the Louvre. So as we're talking about the paintings, the decorative arts, the furniture, it's every category is really museum quality and of the highest quality and rarity, which is something that even us, who work in the industry, we really don't see very often at this level.
And I think certainly to your point, Christine, you can well see this in the living room at Broadway. And another theme you see is this rich layering of different mediums and periods. And although Mrs. Getty really cared for history and provenance, it was of equal importance to her how these pieces would fit together. And everything is connected in the collection. They all almost speak to each other. The one on the left, you can see the large portrait of Nijinsky painted by Jacques-Emile Blanche, formerly in the Daisy Fellows collection, which Mrs. Getty acquired, I believe it was from Christie's in 95. And she really used this painting. It was a spur-of-the-moment purchase at the auction. She went in to purchase a Perfetti box, actually, which has now been gifted to the Getty Museum. But she loved this painting. It resonated with her. Certainly, there's a lot of theater and love of dance in the home. But she was particularly inspired by the Coromandel screen, which you can see behind the figure of Nijinsky here. And she used this as a jumping off point in the decoration of the living room at Broadway. So the Coromandel screen continues beyond the frame and is interspersed with this beautiful emerald green 17th century Chinese gauze. So it's this, which I think was purchased from the Palazzo Corsini sale as well. And it's this wildly sort of imaginative interior that she wove here. And Caitlin, why don't you talk about a couple Dec Arts examples?
Yeah, sure. Well, in addition to this layering being such a unique aspect and inspiration for Mrs. Getty, we've touched on, or Maria's already touched on, the fact that provenance was a very big inspiration for her. And she really took it, it was one of the most important things for her when she was collecting. And in the image on the right, you'll see they're kind of angled, but the Georgian parcel gilt and white painted armchairs right there, those are designed by Vardy, and they were commissioned for the first Earl Spencer and were made for the Palm Room at Spencer House in London. And I think that was maybe circa late 1750s. And in the image to the right front and center, these really beautifully, richly carved Georgian stools with elephants at the front. Those were from Castle Hill in Devon. Now, there are many reasons why the history of ownership is so important. And this can relate to authenticity, to trust in the object itself, Of course, market value, but also the preservation of cultural heritage and legal and ethical issues around that piece of work. But the part of the provenance that really was important to Mrs. Getty was the historic value. That is what really inspired her. And she loved to find works that were rich with history, but also she appreciated the fact that she was weaving herself into that narrative. And she was becoming intimately connected not only with the works of art, but also with the places that they had previously been and the people who had previously owned them. And she understood that an artwork story, that's what makes it of cultural and historic significance. It's not then just the piece of art, it is a piece of history. So I hope that after this talk, you guys go back out and walk around and talk to the dealers here about provenance. You know, you will see they are passionate for it, and especially when it's provenance that they have uncovered through their own research. And there are, you know, some stands out here that have Ann Getty provenance on them as well. I think Hyde Park has some pieces that have come through these doors.
So in an interview Mrs. Getty did with Architectural Digest in 2012, she said, "With imagination, you can make anything work together, and too much harmony tends to be less exciting," which is well encapsulated in this room. All in all, the collection is thoughtful and academic, but she just wildly and boldly imaginative. Mrs. Getty enjoyed breaking the rules, and particularly related to display, but she also didn't take herself too seriously. And I think there's a couple good examples in this room, which the living room or the dining room has been widely photographed, and certainly it can look very intimidating. You've got these incredibly important 1720s panels set in the wall that were made for Schloss Pillnitz, for Augustus the Strong, and the room is anchored by 4 incredibly important pieces of Boule case furniture. But there's wonderful little whimsical touches in this room, which we always like to point out when we are giving tours in the home. One of which you can see in the on the right side. There's a little cluster of 19th century Rita whistles in the shape of reclining boys, which interestingly and kind of surprisingly created into passementerie for the curtains, which is very easily missed. The dining room has an expansive and panoramic view of the San Francisco Bay, not to mention glorious light flowing in. And she just discreetly used these whistles, incorporated them into the curtains. Most people wouldn't notice them. And one time I was giving a tour, walking them through, and they asked, where did she get the inspiration for this? And we always tried to ask Mrs. Gay this because she could be painfully modest and quite hard to figure out where she got her inspiration. But she happened to be in the room when which she normally didn't do, but she was following behind this tour. And I said, I don't know. I've never asked her. I said, Mrs. Getty, where did you get the inspiration to do this? And her response was simply, she just thought it was amusing. So she may have visually seen something at one point. We don't know, but I love that little detail.
And also, didn't she at dinner parties would put a little whistle boy out on the table, and if somebody wanted to give a toast or say a little speech or something, that they would blow their whistle. And it reminds me, actually, we haven't mentioned, but there's another woman and colleague, Debbie Hatch, who many of you may know, who is absolutely one of a kind if you haven't met her. She was actually Mrs. Getty's first curator. She worked at Sotheby's for many years. She was the head of the San Francisco office and then started working for the Gettys. And as I was leaving the home for one of my last times, Debbie sort of snuck one of those little whistle boys into my purse. So I have one, which is really fun that I get to, blow a whistle every once in a while.
I think it was second day on the job for me. And I got a colored one as well. I got one of the painted ones, so I felt very special. But, my favorite example here, you'll see right next to it, of Mrs. Getty's playfulness in the room, because that's what it was about, entertaining her guests and letting them leave with this kind of awe and magic and something that was different from being entertained in any other home. And you'll see my favorite part is the chandelier. It's an Empire chandelier. It hangs over the dining room table. And we've blown up a detail here to show you that in the bowl that's at the base of the chandelier, she placed this Fabergé style goldfish in it. And the idea was then when her guests were coming through, it was the same. She was using the natural light that was coming off of the bay, and it would kind of glisten and almost make it look like she had filled it and it was a fishbowl of water and the fish was swimming around in it. It just shows she really cared about entertaining her guests. And as Maria said, she did not take herself too seriously. She enjoyed the theater and the presentation that she had. And I think it's also so beautiful that she's now added this moment to the story of the chandelier from previously talking about the long stories of where these pieces were. And also to add the story, part of the story to the chandelier is this was also in the Daisy Fellows collection, like the Nijinsky that Maria mentioned earlier.
You know, she certainly, there's this wit and whimsy throughout her interiors, and she's not trying to recreate an 18th or 19th century interior. And she continued to revisit things. She would move things around. She would certainly sell things and move them to different properties. The collection was always moving. So
I was going to say, I mean, the dining room itself, I mean, every aspect of the home, there's surprises everywhere and new discoveries. And I was lucky enough to visit many, many times over many, many years. And honestly, each time when I walked in, I discovered something new and fell in love with another object. But it was really the stories behind Mrs. Getty's imagination that were really incredible. So, you know, when we're talking about this Fabergé goldfish in the chandelier, it was thinking about what if we were sitting at dinner and there was a goldfish swimming in the chandelier? Well, we can't do that, but we can put a Fabergé, fish in there. But one thing you haven't touched on, which is hard to convey on a illustrated PDF, but if you look at the image on the left, you'll see on the left there's just a sliver of a giltwood mirror, and underneath it you can see a chest and a little bit of a dragon boat sticking out. Well, that wall actually connects to another part of the house. And when Mr. and Mrs. Getty were renovating and wanted to merge the two homes, one of the things that she wanted to do was to create this magical element of surprise where she could entertain her guests for an intimate dinner party overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge, overlooking the San Francisco Bay. And afterwards, after dessert, she could say, come into the music room for a concert. And it would be the San Francisco Philharmonic or Pavarotti. And in thinking about how to truly make a spectacular experience for her guests, she said, I want the wall to move. And so you can't see it in the image, but if you can imagine, there's a track it's a hidden track that's underneath the chest of drawers. And what happens is you open up a little panel in the wall, you press a button, and the chest goes one way and the wall goes the other way. And you're welcomed into this beautiful music room. And of course, as you can imagine, the architects and engineers were saying, that's not going to happen. And Mrs. Getty so eloquently put, well, if they can do it at Disneyland, they can do it at my house. So I just loved that she knew what she wanted. She had this incredible imagination, and all of it was about surprise, whimsy, and the experience. And the other thing that I'll say, we're looking at these pictures, and Maria and Caitlin have both touched on that this was a warm family home and that was lived in. We've all sat in these chairs, sat in these sofas. There are members in the audience as well who I know, luxuriated on some of these sofas as well. And that's one of the things that was so magical about the home is that every person who stepped foot and walked through for one of the lavish parties or an intimate dinner was part of the history of that object now, and part of the experience that those silent witnesses to history are now, it's embedded into the fabric of the provenance.
And it breathes new life into it. And I think the other aspect that you touched on earlier about this being such an extensive and large collection, but also of museum quality. When that wall moves, it's an 18th century giltwood Linnell mirror that is also moving and being hidden for this. The Linnell mirror is part of the equation, but it's gone for this event. And the same with the chest. The chest itself is this wonderful Italian chest from the 18th century that's been lifted up. It has not been hurt, but it's been lifted up and put on racks and is now part of the theater of that room.
So we've talked a little bit about the collection and, the sort of vast categories that Mr. and Mrs. Getty collected and Mrs. Getty's eye. And, what I touched on as well is, visiting the home many, many times. And one of the things that really struck me over the years is Mrs. Getty's commitment to preservation, Mrs. Getty commitment to stewardship, and that she really understood that we touched on that she was really only, a small chapter in the provenance of these pieces. And she really embodied what we call conscientious collecting. And that means, that she really relied on professional artisans to conserve and maintain many of the pieces in the collection. One of our professional artisans is actually in the audience here that I see. And, one of the things that she did too is as she was collecting, she would reintroduce certain pieces back into the market. So either through sales or through donations, and really understood that she was just, one player in this cultural ecosystem. And that leads us to the next topic, which is, what is it to be a patron? So my question for you, my next question is, when we're thinking about Mrs. Getty or any, collector for that matter, how do you define patronage and what are the responsibilities associated with it?
You've covered it for me. We can move on. I think there's a wider conversation to be had about what it means to be a patron in the arts today. And the broadness of the term, because people are becoming more creative in how they're thinking about being a patron to the arts. But when it comes down to it, patrons support and promote artists and craftsmen and their endeavors. And Mrs. Getty did this in a wide variety of ways. And so, of course, she was doing that through collecting, but also she was doing that through selling. And she was releasing these eclectic, wonderful works back onto the market so that other people could become excited about them and be a part of them as well. And she was doing this sometimes if the rooms and the residents were changing or aspects of the collection were changing, but also she would do it when she was really engrossed in one of the charitable projects she was working on at that particular moment. She was willing to give away pieces that she loved, to sell items she knew would get the best price at that moment because she wanted to have funds for different aspects of the Bay Area charities that she was involved with.
And we also talk about, with people who are collecting today, the advice that most people will hear or give is buy what you love and buy what you can afford. And, as your collecting journey continues, you may find a better example, and it's perfectly fine to sell and upgrade. I mean, one of the things, hopefully the takeaways from this is, if anybody has a collection similar to Mrs. Getty, please come talk to us after. But most likely, and that's not going to happen for the everyday person, but you can take away elements of this. And whether you're building a collection or you're just acquiring a piece or two to live with that you love, that evokes emotion or brings a beautiful memory, that is what Mrs. Getty did on a very, very grand scale.
So she was playing a part in the ecosystem,
Yes.
really, of the art market specifically. But she was also a public advocate for decorative arts, and she really promoted the category, which is an important part of being a patron for what the category you're collecting in. And she did this through hosting a lot of events at her house and bringing people into the rooms and inspiring new collectors. But she also had tours, and she was always happy to open up her house to art historians or just enthusiasts who were coming through. And then finally, as Christine mentioned, she really did embody being a conscientious collector. And by that, I mean that she understood the responsibility to care for and conserve her works, but also the responsibility to foster the wider group of craftsmen that came through this room. And that's what I'm going to try to concentrate on the next slide. And she also understood the responsibility of preserving the history of these pieces, and that's through careful collection management. So on this slide here, we'll first talk about the importance of preservation through the art itself. And Maria previously mentioned this is a living, breathing collection. It's one of the special treats about collecting decorative arts is that you get to eat off of it. You get to drink out of it. You get to sit on it. You get to hide little treats inside of them. And with use, though, and even careful use, can come damage at times and the need for careful conservation. And Mrs. Getty, she actually had a restoration group come out on annual visits, and they worked on site. There's a stair restoration. Nigel in the back here, Sarah next to him. Please go and talk to them if you need some restoration work, because Nigel is very agile and he will come to you, as you can see. And Mrs. Getty would keep tools on site for their use. And all the staff in the house were also trained to know how to care for a piece when it broke, who to tell, how to retain that bit back so that when that annual visit came, everything could be repaired on site. And, Mrs. Getty was endlessly fascinated by how these restorers worked too. She wanted to know how they gilt. She wanted to know how, if a rosette had fallen and gotten lost, how a mold could be made of another one to duplicate it and put it. And she came and got underneath the furniture with their restorers and would ask questions. That really gave her an appreciation for the skill set of the restorers, but also the time that it takes to do this work with your hands. She worked with painting conservators, worked on paper conservators, with metal workers, with glass blowers, with carvers and gilders. She would bring painters in to cover a whole room in trompe l'oeil, or, of kind of tiles or imaginative engraving. Every room in the residence, as we've seen, was filled with different historic objects, but also all of the settings and the surfaces that these objects were in were also completely decorated to her imagination.
And I'll just say quickly, this is a guest room. This is a guest room.
Yes.
And so if a friend or a family member was staying over, this is the lavish interior of a guest room. And what I think is so incredible about Mrs. Getty is, oftentimes today, a friend will redo a powder room or have, a themed room in their home. Every single room in every single home Mrs. Getty did had this extraordinary theme and attention to detail. And the Turkish room is one of my favorites. And
mine as
Caitlin,
well.
yeah, go
Mine as well.
tell
And I think
everybody about it.
it just also so wonderfully illustrates all the different types of skills that were required for a single room. So the Turkish paneling had to be installed, of course, but it also required repair and it required in-painting, and panels never ever fit the room you bring them into. So additions had to be made, and those additions needed to be painted, matched in kind. And then you also see the all of her textiles were personally picked out and selected, but you can see how she wanted them to be draped and used, and she had seamstresses come in and create the bed hangings and create the curtains. And just such a wonderful room. And it showed that she was protecting her collection through the restoration, but she was really also acting as a patron to an array of craftsmen and promoting the importance of their craft. And conservators and craftsmen really need patrons as well. I think that's a key point that we want to get across here, because they are an equally important part of the art. And we talked about the art market, but of the arts in general and in arts education. And there's skills that you have to be apprenticed in them. They're not skills that you learn in a book. And she understood that they need to be passed down, and she wanted to ensure that these specialized craftsmen had the ability to do so and to celebrate their talent. So the second part of the importance of preservation that I wanted to discuss is the history and the provenance of that. And that's through thoughtful collection management, so that the history of the objects can live on and be celebrated as you're passing them along. It also helps you with proof of ownership, of course, and legal title to the object, and purchase records and up-to-date fair market values. Having those in your collection are really vital for the careful and equitable estate planning that's underway at all times for such a large, extensive estate here. And Christine also did talk about stewardship. I think, it's kind of can be interchangeable, but Mrs. Getty did see herself as a custodian to all of her pieces, and she saw herself as stewarding the collection along and doing what was best for these pieces. And part of that was reuniting works works that had left each other's sides after so much time. And some examples off the top of my head are the dragon girandoles that were in the dining room that you saw. She had 4 that had come back together. They'd been separated into pairs in the 80s, and she was able to reunite them in the 90s. And there's a Grenly bureau and chest of drawers that were in Pride of Place living room. She had brought those back together as well. So she enjoyed reuniting items, but she also cared about the original intent of a maker. And that's the example that I thought would be interesting to show you guys on the screen here. This is a painting called In My Studio by Alma Tadema, and it was painted for his friend and fellow painter, Frederick Leighton. And in the black and white photo, you can see it hung in the silk room, a little red outline on it, and that's back in 1895. And his collection had to be dispersed, as many do. And the Leighton House is now a museum. It's open to the public, and part of their main mission is to reunite his collection and bring as much back into its in situ position so that people can come and see it in the way it was and really learn about the studio house in general that was so popular during this period. And In My Studio is now back, hanging on the same wall as it was intended, as it was painted and made for, and hung where Lord Leighton decided it should have been hung, back next to its friends. And, you know, Mrs. Getty would be thrilled, I think, to know that it's made its way back there.
You know, we're back in the master bedroom. And this is a room where Mrs. Getty put some of the pieces that were most intimate, and I think she really had a little more feminine feeling to this bedroom. She loved Mary Cassatt. There was a lot of Degas in this room. And first, of course, to mention, this painting is now in the collection of the Polo Museum, so it did not go on tour with this recent exhibit, but it's now on display in Japan. Mrs. Getty was incredibly generous in lending her collection, as Caitlin alluded to, making it available to academics and curators and conservators and restorers. And I think she very much felt wanted to not cloister the collection. She wanted to share it with people whenever possible, and we loaned as we could, really. I don't think any loan we ever asked for, she declined, honestly. And pieces, particularly at their primary residence on Broadway, were, you know, often on the road, and were, you know, really available for people, innumerable numbers of people that came through the home, probably thousands of people over the years. They had lots and lots of parties and fundraisers in the house. And I know, beyond even the people we know in the audience here that have been in the home, I suspect many, many other people here today have. And certainly, you know, you can continue to see some of these objects at the fair. It brings us great joy to see things resurface on social media and see a new environment. And I think Mrs. Getty certainly would have been invigorated and excited to see that.
Exactly. So legacy and estate planning, we've covered the collection, we've covered patronage. You know, this sort of leads to how you can use your art collection as, you know, to really talk about the legacy. How do you want your collection, or, you know, your family member, your family collection to be remembered in 20, 50, 100 years? And I know when I was introduced to the collection and to you, there had been quite extensive estate planning that had been going on behind the scenes. So if you could tell us a little bit about that and how collectors today can ensure that both the artwork and their personal vision endure for future generations.
So I think this is a good moment to kind of turn the corner from the collecting to the planning. So when I joined the Gettys, certainly the acquisitions had slowed down. Every home was at capacity. But it was really a great moment to kind of take stock of the collection. I knew aspects of the collection, certainly from visiting many of the residences, and from Mrs. Getty generously loaning to the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, into our fall show. She was very generous in participating. But what I was really kind of blown away was with kind of the personal nature of the collection. And and kind of understanding these were personally invested collectors or collector in collections as well. But the breadth and the magnitude of what Mr. and Mrs. Getty were facing really struck me at that moment. And blessedly, as Christine mentioned, the collection was well managed and cared for. Again, another good call out to Deborah Hatch. Nonetheless, when I came on, I really embarked on the most magical treasure hunt of my life, just really going through every cupboard, going in every property, top to bottom.
After you got over the panic attack of the 9,000 objects, I'm sure.
No, but it's for any of you that love decorative arts, and I mean, it was amazing. I mean, and behind every heaving porcelain cupboard and drawers full of Kunstkammer worthy objects, as I mentioned, just the personal nature of the collection really started to come together for me. And I think having collectors that are so invested is really the best foundation for making plans. And of course, you wouldn't involve collectors. The collectors should be involved in these conversations as well. And, using the case study of the Gettys, first we determined the parameters of the collection. So the who, the what, the where. As you mentioned, there was things were dispersed all over. They were on loan, really making sure we laid eyes on everything. Thankfully, things were already cataloged. And then we really started the conversation with Mr. and Mrs. Getty of what did they want to accomplish with their collection? How did they want the collection to be remembered and themselves? We also certainly wanted to celebrate Mrs. Getty as a collector. She was maddeningly modest and very but her collecting journey and creating a collection, I don't like to just speak to her about her as an amazing female collector, because she was an incredible collector, full stop. But it was remarkable that this was a collection that she built while she was self-educating, truly.
And I think that that's one of the biggest takeaways too, as you're here in the show, is, you don't need an academic background to go to a booth and talk to a dealer and sit in a chair and flip it over and figure out, what makes it special and how has it endured. And that's what I hope, that's one of the takeaways for everybody today, is to continue to be curious and to educate yourself.
I mean, it's certainly this much of what we're saying is true of any collector, that you are so involved in building this collection, and correspondingly you should be involved in its ultimate dispersal. And thankfully the Gettys made this joint decision towards a series of charitable sales during their lifetime. They'd made that decision before Mrs. Getty's sudden passing in September of 2020. And Mr. Getty did decide, after a little time had passed, to proceed and honor their collective wishes to hold these sales at Christie's in 2022 to 2023. We had a large series of sales, and then at Stair Galleries in 2024. And thankfully, Caitlin and I, as mentioned, continue to work with Mr. Getty. Right now, we're really focusing on there's a lot of ongoing museum and institutional gifting and donations that are still taking place. We have these wonderful Denton Hall candle stands designed by Chippendale that were in the living room at Broadway. And we're an early acquisition for Mrs. Getty. I think she purchased those in '82. Now they are on permanent display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art through the generosity of Mrs. Irene Aitken. And Mrs. Getty would be absolutely thrilled that, again, she's part of this provenance. They have this wonderful home that is available for everyone to really enjoy these objects, whether it's in a dealer's booth or in a private collection. And the three of us certainly send each other texts and emails all the time. And, oh, did you see this Instagram post?
It's like seeing an old friend.
It is. No, it's absolutely like seeing an old friend. And it gives us a lot of joy in seeing the continuation of these objects and being enjoyed and invigorated by being in a new environment.
Caitlin, can you tell us a little bit about the
Yes.
philanthropic goals?
Well, that was a really large portion of the legacy planning piece, of course. And there's a variety of philanthropic avenues that are open to art collectors. And of course, that's from some considered museum donations, but also to creating private museums as an institute on its own, or donating to a wing of a museum if keeping the collection together is the priority. But there are also foundation and individual sales that can be done to raise funds for charities that could also be unrelated to the arts or related to them, and also to funding endowments and supporting education within the arts or sciences, and even sometimes donating artwork itself directly to the charity can be of assistance. And I think it's worth just saying that most collectors are multifaceted. They have a variety of interests, really, that they wish to support. And their charities are really deeply personal, and they affect different emotional aspects within their lives. And they're starting to think more creatively, we have seen through our work at the moment, on how they're going to be supporting the variety of charities. So if you go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more specifically about Mr. and Mrs. Getty's philanthropic goals from their art collection. And, it included charitable giving, of course. Philanthropy was a huge part of that. But it also included endowments to help promote education in the arts and ongoing museum gifts that have been done. There are ongoing museum giftings and donations that are underway as well. And the public art sales were held through the Ann and Gordon Getty Foundation for the Arts. And really meaningful funds were raised for California-based arts and education institutes that Mr. and Mrs. Getty had been supporting for decades already. They had an intimate connection with the charities that benefited from that sale. And funds from the same foundation ended up going to the Ann Getty Endowment at the University of San Francisco. And that endowment helps with scholarships for students, but also for faculty. Now there's an endowed chair in her name, and for facility expansions.
I think Mr. and Mrs. Getty also jointly drew inspiration from J. Paul, kind of in some ways bringing a little bit of a circle here, in the desire to really give back, and that they understood the responsibility they had, and the ability to really make effective changes in supporting, as Caitlin said, these charities they've been supporting for decades that were very near and dear to them. And that, of course, that work, of course, continues with Mr. Getty.
And we've seen that with the Gettys, but also with other clients that we've been working on some philanthropic strategies with, that it's been changing a bit recently. There is more of a trend towards this micro focus on community giving and giving circles, and a more personalized approach and feeling to the charities over these more larger charitable entities. And I think that's just people wanting to feel more connected to their giving, but also to see the benefits in their actual communities, and to see that the benefits with local talent who they know, and watching them thrive and be supported.
You guys you're talking a lot about, your current work and what you're doing. And, I myself working in an auction house, I work with private collectors and institutions, as Helen mentioned, but that involves everybody in their orbit. So it could be an estate attorney, it could be an accountant, or an advisor, an art advisor. And you launched Bullimore Partners last year, but your business model is quite different from the sort of traditional commercial art advisor. So could you tell us a little bit about what you're doing, how you arrived at the name, and sort of what are the guiding principles behind Bullimore Partners?
Yeah, so I think, as we mentioned, you certainly want to think about in advance how you want to be remembered, where you see your collection, and who's really best suited to take the responsibility for it going forward. Such care is taken in building one. You want to take equal care in listening to and speaking to not only your family, but your estate planning attorney, your executor, your children, and also institutions that you've worked with as well. So there's realistic expectations. But as we like to say, personal property is very, or tangible assets are very emotional ones. And of course, you should play an active role in where their future is going to be, and who's going to eventually, maybe receiving it as a gift. It's often a blended approach, certainly. So this gentleman on the screen, this is Francis Bullimore, who was originally a butler for Joseph Kennedy and was a longtime butler to J. Paul Getty. When J. Paul passed away, he moved to San Francisco and was, again, longtime butler to Mr. and Mrs. Getty for at least 2 decades, and was a trusted professional advisor and support for the family for the entire time he worked for them. When Caitlin and I were trying to think of our business naming, it's not really about us. It's about supporting the family or the collector, listening to them, providing this discreet, unbiased service to really help guide them in this sometimes very emotional and it can be very complicated and challenging process, but we found it to be incredibly rewarding. And it was quite lovely. We spoke to Mr. Bullimore's executor, and it was very touching. He was quite pleased that his name was living on through the business.
And I'll say, the work that you are doing and how you've set up your business is so important. Even just yesterday, I was at the VIP lunch that my mother-in-law, I'll give her a quick plug, coordinated. And I was sitting next to a woman who said, my mother passed away last year, and my father and my grandfather were avid collectors and involved with their local museum. And she said, she expected that she was going to open up a folder, find a phone number, call the museum and say, bring a truck. And that was not the case. There were no plans, nothing was in place, and those difficult conversations hadn't happened with the 4 children. So it can become incredibly complicated if, and nobody wants to talk about this side, but, as a steward, you have to think about, how are you going to ensure that these works of art live on. And so what you are doing working with families directly is so important.
That was a key takeaway from this experience for us, and really was the kind of founding moment for Bullimore Partner, was watching how early planning is really important. So if you're saying, what can a collector learn from the legacy planning piece of the Ann and Gordon Getty collection? We would say plan early. Have these conversations with your family, with museums, with anyone who's going to be benefiting from the art in any way. And, Maria touched on this for a moment, talking about how these tangible objects are extremely emotional. There's something talismanic about art. We imbue an emotional attachment to a piece. And it could be hugely valuable for us, but maybe not for the beneficiary, or vice versa. And you need to have these conversations because you may place a lot of importance on a piece while another doesn't see it or sees an important piece that you haven't seen. So it's best to just plan early, talk. Just have some conversations. But also because we don't know what tomorrow will hold. That's been proven already this January 2025 with these horrendous and awful fires in California that have touched so many of us, especially our lovely Christine, who's from Pacific Palisades right here. So you don't know what the future will hold, and you really do need to have plans, even if you think you have more time ahead. And the last part of that is also, I think, it's good to understand that there can be complications within an estate. There could be items that have endangered material and are CITES pieces, and they might have sale restrictions. They might not. It could depend on import and export paperwork that you have. It could depend on what state you live in. You may have a painting that has restitution issues and a title claim that you're unaware of. You might have a piece with authenticity issues, and it takes time. You can find solutions, but it takes time to work those through, and it's best to be doing that while you have the capacity to do so, instead of leaving it in the estate to your beneficiaries to be dealing with that.
Well, that wraps up our conversation, but we did want to allow a little bit of time if anybody has any questions.
Thank you so much for the presentation. Is there anything that's particularly reflective of Mrs. Getty that the general public wouldn't necessarily know about a particular piece in the house?
Frequently we're asked, what's our favorite piece in the house, right? Or what, and that can be answered, or the most important thing, that can be answered in so many different ways. There's things that are emotional to to me or to Caitlin or Christine, things that are academically important. We all have this, okay, if there's a catastrophe, this is the object I'm going to run out of the house with. However, one thing I wanted to, we often are asked this, so full disclosure, we are kind of prepared with a couple of our favorite things slides. So on the screen here, you can see these wonderful, and I'm a big ceramics and porcelain lover, so I wanted to pick some ceramics or porcelain. You have these wonderful Arita puppies, 17th century. A comparable pair are in Burley, and I remember going to Burley 25 years ago, seeing these puppies. So it was wonderful for me to see a comparable pair again in the Getty home. But I love how Mrs. Getty ingeniously combined it with this 19th century triple gourd vase. It has this little echoing element of the puppy's tail on the base of the vase. And these are wonderful. She was so magical in these beautiful little passages. And again, this kind of little wit or sense of humor. And I love how that's kind of embodied in this object. So
I went a different direction from Maria. And so I'm showing one of the pictures from the collection that has always really resonated with me for a variety of reasons. And the first is because this is a portrait of Sarah Bernhardt, who was a French stage actress in the 19th century. And I think at that point in time, that would take a lot of grit and strength and talent. And Mrs. Getty was a huge supporter of women. And I see that when I look at this picture. She also didn't just support fine and decorative art. She really cared about performing arts, music, dance, theater. So that comes across to me here too. And then also just the kind of like slightly wild, wonderful red hair reminds me of her. So to me, this was kind of a little bit of the best of Mrs. Getty to me. And then also this picture resonates with me for personal reasons. I, like Miss Getty, I have affinity for Europe. I spent the first decade of my career living and working in London. And I also love performing arts. I was a ballet dancer through university and still took adult classes when I was in London. And I grew up going to England with my family to see Shakespeare in the Globe. My mother is a professor. She teaches Shakespeare and Chaucer. And Sarah Bernhardt would play in Shakespearean performances. She played male and female characters. She played Hamlet on stage. And finally, I love imaginative, talented women. And I absolutely include Mrs. Getty as one of them. And I think this also brings up kind of an interesting point of helping hear like why Maria really loves a piece or why I do. A lot of times people wonder why collectors take a certain direction with their collection. And I think the direction's really dictated by an individual's upbringing. It's trips you've been on. It's an important family member who's introduced you to something, something you've been exposed to and you put emotional attachment on. And for many collectors, they're trying to keep that initial interest living on through their collection and the associations made with it. And I think that's kind of legacy itself. When we're concentrating so much on legacy here, it's honoring something or someone who's helped lead you in that direction. And I wonder if Christine has what's your legacy? What do you love in the collection?
Well, I'm a gemologist, so of course all the jewelry. But particularly there was a tulip brooch by Jar that was so dynamic and so beautiful, and the diamonds and the colored sapphires and the craftsmanship involved. It's wearable sculpture, it's wearable art. Some of the jewelry vendors here at the show have works by Jar, and I encourage you with the jewelry itself to handle it, feel it, flip it over, look at the back. I mean, these are artists in themselves. So that, I would say, I would want that brooch right here.
So Mr. Getty loved the collection, but it was really Mrs. Getty that was the driving force. She really made the selections. There were a couple pieces that we found out actually later. Mr. Getty was like, oh, I wanted the Almatamus. He's like, I helped pick that one out. He was wonderfully supportive in this process as well. Mr. Getty has, but they did share this joint love of science and music and theater. And the house really comes alive and is the embodiment of that. So although he was not the driving force in the collecting, the collection certainly showcases Mr. Getty and a lot of his interest as well.
Particularly in the music room where he would perform and where he would have his musicians come and perform, and still does. All of the artwork that Mrs. Getty was selecting were of cellists and piano players, and she was ensuring that the whole feel of and there was a unity in the room that was around his music.
I'm kind of intrigued as to whether she just decided, I want a Turkish room, or did she find the paneling or the bed or something? How did that room actually come about?
That's a great question. So certainly, Mrs. Getty, when she saw things, whether it was at auction or with a dealer or on her travels, she just bought things she loved. Sometimes she had a place and purpose in mind. I'm trying to remember when she actually bought that paneling. I think it was right when she was renovating the home. So, although they moved into, when they moved into Broadway in the early 70s, then they purchased the house next door, and they really moved beyond there and started the renovation around in the early 90s. So I think she just loved the paneling, and that was certainly the inspiration for it. But in every auction, she put Post-its all over her auction catalogs, and we have a lot of annotations in them that, this would be great for this space or that space. But if she loved something and it was great, she just bought it. And then she found a space for it later, whether it was in her home or in somebody else's home.
And the rooms would change based on one particular piece that came up. And for the Turkish room, it was, we found the invoice for these panels. They came from Paris. And the rest of the room came around them. But also, she wasn't specifically just doing a Turkish room. It was still an imaginative creation. And something you couldn't see in the photo that we were just talking about yesterday is around the corner in the dressing room area. She actually had...
Chair. The Osler chair.
No, not even that. You can go in that direction if you like too. But I was thinking about the William Morris paneling, that she actually inserted these William Morris fabrics and textiles within the frames of the Turkish doors. And they are completely unrelated from different periods, different cultures, but they do work. And it was just a little bit of the pattern and the coloring that she imagined and saw, and no one else would think to do this, but it looks fantastic.
What an illuminating lecture. So thank you so much. I just wanted to know how their collection inspired purchases of all of their homes. Did they buy a home to fit the collection, or did they renovate to fit certain pieces? I know you kind of just touched on that, but they had a lot of properties. So was it something they built from the ground up? And what types of renovations did they do?
Mostly the properties were in place, and then she furnished it. One property, which we felt a little bad not really talking about today, but was Wheatland, which was Mrs. Getty's childhood home, which is outside of Sacramento. And again, lots of people in the audience here spent a lot of time in Wheatland as well. And that property had a little bit more of an English country house sort of feel or theme to it. It was a little more comfortable, slightly more feminine in nature, but was also filled with wonderful Dutch still lifes, which was a reference to Mrs. Getty's Dutch and English heritage. So I think given that that was more of a private family home, that's where these things that were a little more kind of related more to her family history would be installed. So it was very thoughtful in where she would place things, but for better or for worse, I think many family members, she just would say, okay, I'm furnishing your home. And she would just go, which was wonderful. And they're all very different. And she was often inspired somewhat by the architecture. Another quick property I'll mention was Temple of Wings, which was this incredible folly of a Maybach-inspired home. And that was this fantasy home filled with British aesthetic movement and arts and crafts and Tiffany and just this incredible layering. And but she would play with her interiors. So she certainly drew inspiration from her homes as well.
And that home in particular was where Isadora Duncan danced. So there are historic images of Grecian-clad women out dancing in the front underneath these Roman capitals. And she had Fortuny gowns that she started to invest in because they fit the history of how that building had previously been in use. And then it became a different collecting angle that she was relating to someone in her family with. And she was jointly collecting for the Temple of Wings property. And that's why it took the more Victorian and arts and crafts turn, because she was working with a family member who was really excited about that period, and it was a way for them to connect and work together, and for her to foster that collection bug even within the family for the next generation of the Gettys.
Your discussion about what happens to a collection when the collector or the collectors are no longer alive is so interesting. And this was such a personal, extraordinary environment filled with treasures. I'm curious about whether there was ever any discussion about it staying intact and becoming a kind of Frick museum for San Francisco.
So what I would say is there was a brief moment that we did explore that possibility. I think logistically, given where the home is located in San Francisco, it makes it a little complicated and difficult. But I think ultimately, and as I said, really speaking to Mr. and Mrs. Getty and presenting them with options, and I think they felt the best option to benefit their charities, which is ultimately what they wanted to share the proceeds from the sale of their collection to their benefit. It was decided that the best avenue was to, really send these objects back out into the art market.
But I think that also speaks to, each collection is different and each collector's goals will be different. And this is why we're saying, the Ann and Gordon Getty collection is just simply a case study. And that there are collections that are as vast in terms of volume or category, but there also are not, and very different collections that are focused on contemporary art or, a single category. And that's where what Maria and Caitlin are doing comes into play. Well, thank you, Caitlin and Maria, for traveling from San Francisco to join us today.
Thank you for having
And
us.
thank you for all of you for spending your afternoon with us.